In our world today, people so often just want to be seen. That's how they say it, right? And what they mean by that is they want to be noticed, but they also want to be validated for where they're at. They want acceptance. They want tolerance. And so often I think what we do is we think about this idea of encouragement that we're going to talk about this morning as being another form of that idea of validation. I don't know about you, but when I think about being encouraged, I think about kind words being said to me. And not just kind words, but thoughtful. I guess I'm the only preacher in the room, but this is one of the many preachers' favorite illustrations. Is one time a friend of mine actually had this happen to him. He was somewhere preaching in a gospel meeting, and another preacher was there. And when he left, he said, "Thank you for your effort." What does that mean, by the way? By the way, if you ever come out and say, "Thank you for your effort," just realize in my mind I'm going, well, that was a bomb. We won't preach that lesson again. And I already know some of you are going to come out today and say, "Thanks for your effort, Terry." Brandon, John Dean, I could go around, Flynn. When you think about encouragement, you think about, hey, that really helped me. You made me think. Not, thanks for trying. But I think sometimes our problem is we don't really understand what the word encouragement probably means. Now, if we were to look at this from just the English form of the word of encouragement, I'll look at a couple definitions. One of those is to inspire with courage, spirit, or hope, to spur on. Another one is to make someone more likely to do something. I really like the idea of to spur on. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but if you think about a literal spur, that encouragement the horse receives is not necessarily pleasant. They spur on a horse by jabbing a sharp metal object into its side. Right, Scott? That's what we do. And I don't think at any point would we look at that and go, well, that has to feel good. In fact, it's the opposite. And even that idea, those definitions help us to see a little bit of what encouragement can be. It's not always kind. But I will tell you, as I hope we'll see this morning, it should not necessarily be unkind. And it certainly should not be hateful or vengeful or hostile. Because when you go and talk to somebody, when you confront somebody, when you partake in some kind of conflict with the wrong kind of motivation that ends up being hostile and angry and hateful, that is not what we're talking about this morning. But I do want us to understand that encouragement is not always positive. Sometimes we encourage our children to be better versions of themselves. That's what growth looks like. As they mature, we want them to grow and mature into a better person along the way. Sometimes that is achieved through kind words, and sometimes that is achieved through correction and discipline. But all of that is encouraging them, motivating them to be influenced to become something more than they currently are. In 2 Timothy 4, in verse 2, when Paul said, "Preach the word, be ready in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching," it is quite common for preachers to talk about how 2/3 of those things are negative. Reproving and rebuking aren't viewed as something that is welcome. But I would suggest to you that really what is going on there is that the whole process is positive. Why? Because you are encouraging, you're exhorting someone to be built up into something better than they currently are. Imagine for a moment that you have a house and that it has structural damage to it. When you go to fix that structural damage, what is required for you first is to remove the damaged part of the structure. And before you can change it and build it into what it should be, there has to be a bit of demolition in the process. Is that done to harm the building, though? Well, no. It's not harmed to damage it permanently, but rather the damage that is done through demolition is done to build that structure back up into something that is solid and functional. It is interesting, the word exhort, encourage is often used or defined in the terms to build up. The idea of building something up. Just in the same idea of that illustration of a structure. We want to build things up into something that is good. In 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 14 it says, let all things be done in love. And I want to just quote that and put that here to remind us that whatever we say, whatever we do, always has to be done in love. And that includes rebuking and reproving from 2 Timothy 4 verse 2. If love is not the foundation of that, this morning we were in Matthew 22. What are the two greatest commands? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you go to actually have some kind of a confrontation in the name of encouragement, it better be done out of love, the same way you would want to be treated. That's the second greatest commandment. When we think about encouragement not always being positive, the Proverbs comes to mind from Proverbs 27. Better are the open rebuke than hidden love. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Profuse are the kisses of an enemy. And the idea that the wise man is saying is, it's better for somebody to love you and to come to you and to say things to you to help you be a better person than somebody who wants to see your demise just accept you and validate you when you're wrong. But I want you to turn to Hebrews chapter 12. I grinned a little bit when John said turn to Hebrews 12 because I thought, oh boy, he might have saw this passage I'm going to use, and he didn't. He read before that. But I want you to look at verse 5 and 6. And thanks, John, for the setup, but that was intentional. But I want you to look at verse 5 and 6. You have forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons. Now just stop there. The Hebrew writer says, have you forgotten the exhortation? Some translations use the encouragement that addresses you as sons. And then notice what he goes on to quote. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary and reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. Now, what is it that the Hebrew writer says here is exhortation and encouragement? That God disciplines and chastises the ones he loves. We don't think of chastisement as love. We don't think of discipline as encouragement. But to go back to the parenting analogy, is a parent loving his child when he refuses to correct and discipline and even chastise? Well, no. If we go back to the Proverbs, it says that a father who does not discipline has set his heart on his son's destruction. At the end of the day, we do understand in the realm of parenting that sometimes chastisement and discipline and correction are actually positive and good and necessary. And here the Hebrew writer is saying, don't forget that this discipline and this chastisement God gives you, he gives it because he loves you. And that should build you up. That's exhortation and that's encouragement. In John chapter 3 and verse 20, the same word is used when it says, for everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his work should be exposed. It's the same word there that is translated exposed. This correction, this chastisement, this exposure that is often seen as a word rebuke or exhortation. All of that, I say, is to help us understand this, that encouragement is what happens when we encourage people to come out of the darkness and walk in light. And what that means is encouragement is when we are trying to influence others to walk righteously, to walk by faith. And can that be done positively? Well, sure. But there are also times when unfortunately it may require a rebuke, a correction, reproving. And I think the relationship that we're going to look at this morning, that we've already talked about in the video, of Jesus and Peter, is a great relationship to see this in. Because what we see in Jesus and his relationship with Peter is him encouraging Peter to become who he thinks he can be. By the way, I don't know if you notice this or know this, but Peter and Jesus are mentioned together in the combined Gospels about 195 times. The rest of the apostles are mentioned 130. And if you were to break down who's mentioned by name, second to Peter, it would be John with 39 mentions. Now, that does not include the times that John refers to himself as the one who Jesus loved. So just to be clear, there's a few more there. But the relationship with Peter and Jesus dominates the gospel story. There's no way to look beyond that. And the first time we come to this is in John chapter 1, when Jesus has told some disciples to follow him. And there in verse 4, he says, one of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, we have found the Messiah, which means Christ. He brought him to Jesus. And then notice what Jesus does. Jesus looked at him and said, Simon, the son of John, you shall be called Cephas, which means Peter. It's interesting here that Jesus, from the beginning, we don't see any small talk or anything like that, just a name change out of the blue. Hey, nice to meet you. Here's your new name. But wrapped up in this naming, this is a declaration of Jesus of who Peter will become. And what you realize is, from the very beginning in the gospel accounts, Jesus sees Peter for who he will be, not who he is. He sees him for the potential he has, and he is determined and committed to help Peter reach that. And the declaration, by changing his name to Cephas, is a declaration of Jesus' commitment to that. In Luke chapter 5, which is actually probably the third calling of Peter to follow him, we see that story where they are out there on the boat and Jesus is using their boat kind of as a stage to talk to a multitude. And then he tells Peter, put down your nets. And Peter says, Lord, we fished all night. We didn't catch anything. But because you told me to, we'll put down our nets. And the nets begin to break. And another boat has to come because the catch is so large that they can't contain it in one boat. And Peter then responds with faith, knowing who Jesus is. He says there in verse 8, when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, depart from me, for am I a sinful man, O Lord? For he who and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of the fish that they had taken. So also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching men. And verse 11 says, when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. There are three different instances where Peter interacts. We didn't read the middle one, but starting there in John chapter 1, and here to Luke 5. And here it is when Jesus says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I'm going to teach you how to catch men, that they leave the boats behind. Just to skip forward, the moment that Jesus dies, what does Peter go back to? Because he doesn't know what to do in John 21. He goes back to his boats. But starting from here, he follows Jesus. In Matthew chapter 14, Jesus feeds the 5,000. And then he sends his people away, his disciples away on the boat across the sea. And he remains behind in order to pray. And this is the night where the storm comes and Jesus decides to walk on the water. He's going to pass them by. They're afraid. He shouts out, do not be afraid. It is I. They think it's a ghost. But I want you to notice there, starting in verse 28 that we read earlier, that Peter realizes, hey, this is not normal, right? Walking on the water is not normal. And that's where he says, well, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you. And what does Jesus say? Come. I want you to stop there before we get to the other part that we know. I want you to realize, and I've preached on this before, Peter experiences something with the Son of God nobody else gets to. he walks on water. The other 11 guys sit in the boat. They don't even have the idea to do anything. None of them say anything. None of them even say, hey, Lord, how about me? No, they all sit there. But Peter gets out and he walks on the water far enough that when he begins to sink, Jesus can reach out and save him. And Jesus is far enough when this story begins that they don't know who he is. And I don't know how far that is, but it's more than a couple of feet. But at some point, Peter's faith that got him out of the boat, that kept him walking on the water in the middle of a storm, switches. And he stops looking at Jesus, and he sees the wind, and he gets scared, and Jesus reaches out and saves him. And then he says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt me?" In that whole interaction with Jesus, the invitation to walk, the rescue, the chastisement, which was encouragement for Peter and which was not? I would suggest all of it is. Jesus encouraged Peter to walk by faith and not by sight in a truly remarkable moment. When the time came that Peter's faith began to waver, Jesus lifts him up out of the water and gives him the words of encouragement to have the faith to continue with the same amount of faith. And it's not much longer we wait till Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus asks, well, who do people say that I am? And some say Elijah, and some say Jeremiah, one of the prophets, some say John the Baptist. And he turns and says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter replies, you are the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're the anointed one. You're the Son of the living God. And Jesus responds to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood have not revealed this to you, but my Father who's in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Thus he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. And by the way, I am not suggesting in any of this that Peter was given some official role within the church, like some claim of being the head of the church, maybe the role called the Pope. But I am telling you that Jesus is shaping and molding Peter for leadership. I will also add that these same keys he gives to Peter, he gives to all of the disciples. But in this moment, this is about Peter. But what happens is an interesting Peter moment, because Jesus goes from that, as we've often talked about, we talked about recently in our Matthew class several weeks ago, when once they realize Jesus is the Messiah, then Jesus starts changing his message to them and saying, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, and in 3 days I'm going to be raised up. And Jesus does that immediately here in Matthew chapter 16. And notice what Peter says there in verse 22. Far be it from you, Lord, this will never happen to you. Jesus, he goes from saying, you're the Son of God, and Jesus says, that's right, I'm going to have to go and be a sacrifice and be killed and be raised on the third day. And Peter says, oh no, you won't. And then Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You're a hindrance to me. You're not setting your mind on things of God, but on the things of man. And as harsh as that rebuke may sound, what is Jesus really doing? He is trying to get Peter to focus on the right thing. That's encouragement. He's saying there, Peter, your mind's not set it on the right things. You're thinking fleshly. This is spiritual. Get your mind right. Stop living in the flesh. Now, lest you be afraid that we read all 195 interactions of Jesus or mentions of Peter's name, they're not 195 interactions, but all of the interactions, rest assured we were not going to read the Mount of Transfiguration, although there's a pivotal moment, or when Jesus washes the feet in John 13, and Peter says, Lord, you'll never do this. And he says, if you don't let me do this, you have no part of me. Well, then my whole body. Nope, your feet are enough. Again, classic Peter. Or the story of Peter where he's in the garden, Jesus is being arrested, and he draws his sword and cuts off the ear of Malchus the servant. But we do need to talk about the time at the end where Jesus tells Peter that he's going to deny him. And Peter says, I will never deny you. And Jesus says, yeah, you will. And when the rooster crows, you'll know that I told you this. And it's Luke who records this. We won't read that whole interaction of how he's out there by the fire with the people. Someone comes up and says, you were with him. No, I wasn't. They say it again. He begins to change his language to try to hide. And then in verse 20, at Luke 22 and verse 60, Peter records it this way. Man, I do not know what you're talking about. And while he was speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Don't you know that look had to be brutal? And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he said to him, before the rooster crows, today you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly. I don't know what that must have felt like for Peter to have sat in that moment for 3 days. To sit in a place where he has denied knowing Jesus, the very one who said, you're the Christ, you're the Son of the living God. I don't know who he is. He's a nobody to me. And yet we know Jesus is raised from the tomb. We know he appears to the apostles. We also know the story of John chapter 21, how that Peter says one day that he's going fishing. And Jesus shows up and they eat breakfast together. And we're not going to dive into all this. We've done that previously, but there are a lot of parallels between what happens in John 21 and the story of Jesus' betrayal by Peter. The fire is described the same way in both scenes. But at some point after breakfast, Jesus pulls Peter aside. And he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? In verse 15, he says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said, feed my lambs. And he said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said, tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus then said, feed my sheep. And then he says, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry where you do not want to go. In verse 19, John explains this. This he said by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after that he said, follow me. Verse 20, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, and the one who also leaned back against him during the supper and said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? And Jesus said, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Typical Peter fashion. Well, what about John? Don't worry about John. You follow me. But what's important to know that is going on here is that Jesus is making sure Peter knows that he forgives him for the betrayal. Peter is being given grace. Why does Jesus ask the question 3 times? Because Peter denied him 3 times. What is the point of all of this? Do you love me? Yes, I love you. Well, then feed the sheep, tend to the sheep, lead the sheep. What is it that Jesus is saying? When Jesus met Peter, what did he say? I'm changing your name. Not because of who you are, but because of who you're going to be. And what is he doing here? Go be who I have been helping you become. Lead these sheep in this kingdom. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that the first half of Acts largely focuses on Peter. And by the way, that doesn't mean the other apostles that are left are doing nothing. It's just that Peter is the focal point, just as he's been in the Gospels. What you see in this relationship between Jesus and Peter is what encouragement really looks like. Encouragement is not always just saying, everything's okay, just keep doing what you're doing. Encouraging is inspiring people to become the best version of themselves, which is ultimately walking by faith in righteousness with God. And sometimes that will be through kind words of encouragement. Sometimes that will be gentle nudges to get back on track. And sometimes that will feel a lot more like confrontation, because encouragement won't always make you smile or feel good, but it will always help you to develop a closer relationship with God. In fact, love requires those kinds of conversations. Love requires for us to love to a degree where we say the hard things at the difficult times out of the best interest for each other. I've often used the example of a child playing in the road on a busy street. In Memphis, for the majority of the 10 years, we lived on an extremely busy road, 4-lane road. And we didn't really let the kids, when they're younger, play in the front yard. We wanted them to play out back or even inside because the road was so busy. But what if you drove by and you saw our kids playing in the middle of the road? And you said, "Do you know your kids are in the street?" "Oh yeah, they'll be okay. We just love them too much to tell them to get out of the street." Well, that's foolishness. You've got to get them out of the street, Terry. They're going to get hit. "Oh, they'll be okay. People will avoid them. They'll figure it out eventually. We don't want to upset them." That's not how that works. Encouragement sometimes is saying, get out of the street. The risk is too great. Get back on track. Straighten up. It's always done out of love. I don't know that any disciple tested Jesus in this area more than Peter, right? At least that we know of. And I will confess to you that I identify with Peter a lot more than Paul. Because Paul makes a lot of sacrifices, and I know he's not perfect, but he sure seems to be. And I'm a whole more like Peter that just says dumb things at the wrong time. And I'm thankful for a Savior that says, here's the grace to cover that. And here's how you grow. And here's how you're better. Let me share a few things with you quickly, and then we'll be done. Just some tips how we can encourage like Jesus. Number one, recognize the potential in other people. When Jesus meets Peter, he immediately says, you're going to be somebody. You're going to be better than who you are today. You're going to mean something. I'm changing your name because of that. By the way, when you think about name changes in the Bible pointed out like that, think about the other one would be Jacob to Israel. Same thing, right? You're going to become something. It's the same idea here. Jesus immediately recognized that. Here's something I want you to realize, though, that if you were there at that time, you may not have thought that about this smelly fisherman from Galilee. Because later on in Acts, what do they say about the people from Galilee? Well, these people, they're not educated. They're not valuable. Sometimes we look at people and we might see them that they're just not who we want to hang around. Maybe they've got colored hair and tattoos and piercings and those kind of things, and we want to go the other way. I just want to tell you something. Every person is made in the image of God, which means every person has potential. It is our job to see the potential and be the person that loves them enough to help them reach that potential. So you got to start there. Recognize the potential in everybody. I once had somebody say to me one time when I was talking about evangelism and I talked about a specific thing, and somebody spoke out in class and goes, well, those people don't want Jesus. Well, I'm just going to tell you, if you've ever talked about those people in any context like that, you failed at step one. Because you've already made a judgment that they're not worthy. Everybody is worthy of the gospel and everybody's worthy of your time because Jesus died for you while you were still a sinner. Secondly, meet others where they are. Jesus always meets Peter where he's at. If he's sinking, Jesus lifts him up. He doesn't sit there and go, told you so. Right? And sometimes that's what it means to meet people where they are. Be what they need in the moment. Sometimes that's lifting them up when they need to be lifted up. Not saying, hey, I told you so. I told you not to do that. See what happens when you do that? It's not what Jesus does. Now, sure, he says, why did you doubt? But even that is a response to the moment. Meet people where they are. That is the only way you can take them to where God wants them to be, is to meet them where they are. Thirdly, be patient. Wow. How patient was Jesus, by the way? I mean, think about this. You go from these stories of Peter saying things he shouldn't to this great, the confession that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And most of us will think, finally, I got Peter where he needs to be. And immediately in the context, Lord, you're wrong. Immediately in the context. I have to go die. No, you won't. Get behind me, Satan. Or the scene where Jesus is washing his feet, and Peter says, no, you're not going to do that. If you don't let me, you have no part of me. We'll do everything. No, that's not how that works either. Even in John 21, where Jesus is essentially saying, I forgive you. Go do this mission. Well, what about him? Peter, just follow me. By the way, that may be one of the harshest things Jesus says in the context when you really think about it. Peter, stop, just follow me. Would you for once? And I don't see that. That's how I would respond to Peyton. Peyton, be quiet, hush, do what I said. Nope. Jesus says, what is that to you? Follow me. We have to be patient. We also have to be gentle. I used to read that statement in Matthew 14, you of little faith, as this really harsh rebuke of Peter, until I realized when Jesus says it, I don't know anybody else could even hear it. He's not rebuking him in front of the other 11 guys in the boat. It's a much more kind and tender moment probably than we've ever thought of. They're far enough from the boat, you can't tell who they are. It's a storm, there's wind. They're shouting back and forth across the water, it appears. And Jesus then just turns in that moment and says, why did you doubt me? Sure, it's a chastisement, but it's a lot tenderhearted, more tenderhearted than I think we think of. And even the get behind me, Satan, while that is a rebuke, I think he says that in a pretty gentle way. Get behind me, Satan. Your mind's in the wrong place. And he certainly didn't say it to humiliate or embarrass Peter. It was correction. Listen, correction doesn't feel good, but it is a necessary part of life. And when you are the one receiving it, we do need to remember this person loves you enough to do that. When you're the one giving it, if you do it out of love, it will always be gentle. And finally, just stay focused on the goal. What was the goal? The goal for Peter was for him to walk righteously by faith and share the good news of the kingdom. That was the goal. What is the goal for all of us? To walk righteously by faith and share the good news of the kingdom so others can do the same thing. Encouragement is not, the idea of encouragement we're talking about is not encouraging somebody on how to be a financial success. It's not encouraging somebody to get their academic success, go to the right institution, do the right things, to be somebody who has a great reputation. That's not what we're talking about. If you're thinking about encouragement in those lines, you're thinking the same way Peter did when Jesus called him Satan in that moment. Your mind is on things here, not on the things where they should be. Listen, if people have their PhD and they make millions of dollars and they could buy and sell the world because of the power they have, but they go to hell, they are a failure. They have failed at life. But if my kid grows up to cut grass, and he serves God, that's all I can ask for. And when it comes to everybody here, that's all that matters, is walking with God. Walking righteously by faith. And it's my job to encourage you to do that. And sometimes that's going to happen with a kind word, and sometimes it may be a bit sharper than that. It's also your job to do that for every person in this room, and it's our job to do that every person that's not in this room. When we talk about leading like Jesus, this is what it looks like. This is what encouragement really is encouraging people to walk with our God. And may Jesus be the king of their life. We see in him and Peter that pattern, and we should imitate that as well. I love this song, Do You Know My Jesus? What a great song. And all I want to tell you is if you don't know Jesus this morning and you'd like to, come find me or talk to someone else here. We'd love to share Jesus with you and what that means. We'd love to encourage you to know Jesus and to walk with Jesus in your life, to walk righteously by faith. Let's stand, let's sing.